Hello, welcome to Stories in Time. My name is Eloise Schottler. I'm a storyteller. I'm going to tell you a story that's probably unknown that I found in research I've been doing for the past 2.5 years on World War I. For that length of time, I've been working on a story called Ready to Serve, and it's about 64 nurses from Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, Maryland. Women who may not have been born in Maryland, but considered themselves to be Marylanders because they were graduates of the Hopkins Nursing School, and many of them stayed there after. A little backup. In 1914, the world went to war in Europe. On one side were the British and the French, and on the other side were the Germans, the Austrians, and any of their allies. It was a killing war that went on for days and years. And by 1916, the United States was in an uproar of indecision. Should they enter the war to help the allies of the British and the French, or should they just hold back and stay out of it? One of the things that caused Congress to decide that we would enter that war is because we're a country of immigrants. And many of the people who lived in the United States at that time, 1917, had family in either side. And they were torn. I think their big idea, or the big hope, was that if the Americans got into it, they could make a huge difference and stop it. Just finish it off and stop it. Now, in 1917, Congress voted that the Americans would enter the war. April the 6th, they voted. But for a year before that, they had known, the Army and the Red Cross had known that if you sent troops overseas, you had to send doctors and nurses and hospitals in order to take care of them. War is known for one thing, really: injury, hurt, and killing. They had to be prepared for that. And they were. They asked in 1916, they started asking the big hospitals all over the country to put together a traveling hospital. Not a MASH, that was much later, but a traveling unit that could go over and take care of a certain spot or make a hospital in a place. Johns Hopkins was one of the first to jump in, and they got right to it and had their hospital ready. So in 1917, when they declared war, they told the nurses, there were 64 nurses that were going to be going with the Hopkins Hospital, that they'd let them know when they were going to go. And they sailed on June the 14th. 100 years ago, the doctors, the nurses, the corpsmen at Hopkins and at other hospitals all over the country knew that they would be going overseas to a war, as did the young men who volunteered, who signed up, and who went into the Army. I tell this story as an 80-year-old woman. Why? I am an 80-year-old woman. The nurses were 25 to 44. You'd think I had lost my mind if I tried to convince you that I was 25 years old. So I tell their story as one nurse telling what happened to her, and it's made from letters that I read, lots of letters from many of them. I'm going to take one story out and tell it to you now. I call this story The Black Dog. I love this story. It was January 1918 now. We'd been there 6 months, and I was assigned to night duty in 2 wards. Our wards were in barracks that were across a road from each other. And I had 2 of them at night. I was on night duty, which I really liked because there weren't a lot of people around to tell you how to do it. I was a good nurse. I knew how to do it. And so just going along in charge at night, I was fine. There were 45 patients in each one of those wards, and it was cold. You can't believe how cold it was. It never got this cold in Maryland. Never. It was so cold that when the snow was high and the icicles were down, they touched. That's the truth. We were wearing everything that we owned when we came out in the ward or going from barracks to barracks. It was almost like if I had fallen down, you could have just pushed me and I would have rolled right across that road. Well, anyway, I want to get back to what I want to tell you about. We had to work hard at night. I had one corpsman. His name was Hawkins. I liked him. We'd worked together before. He was a young man from Baltimore. I really liked him. And he was so good-hearted and active. One night, I was going over to the other ward. There was a corpsman over there waiting for me, and Hawkins was back where I was starting out. We had to change the hot water bottles every 2 hours because they were so cold that they would freeze. And if we didn't keep them hot, then we were endangering the lives of those patients laying there. The year before, a couple of French soldiers had died in these beds from the cold. That made you feel responsible. Well, one night, I was going over to the other one. It was hard, and I got over there, I did my job, and I was on the way back. It was about 3 o'clock in the morning, and as I came back over the wooden pieces that were on the ground so that we had some kind of a sidewalk of a kind to walk on, I heard this thump, 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 thump. At first it scared me. I didn't know what to think. Thump, 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 thump in the dark. And as I came closer to the building, the light from the building filtered out through the window, and the thump, thump, thump was a big black dog. A big black dog that was huddled up against the wall of those barracks. Thump, 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 thump. I looked, and then I ran the rest of the way into the barracks. I came in, shut the door, and as I came over, Hawkins walked up, and I said, "Hawkins, there's a big black dog outside." "Ma'am, a dog? A big black dog?" "Yes, there's a big black dog out there." And he grabbed his coat and pulled it on, and before I could stop him, he was outside. Came back in a minute. "Ma'am, we've got to bring that dog in. It's going to die tonight. It'll freeze right out there in the cold. You ought to see him, and he's just shaking and shaking." I said, "I heard him thumping up against the wall, his tail. Shaking, shaking, shaking." "All right." So he went out and he coaxed the dog forward. It was a big dog. It was. And he brought him in, and we had a little office. And in that office, there was a small pot-bellied stove. And part of his job was to keep it warm, to keep the fire going, and we tried to keep it so that the stove got a little bit red hot. A little bit red hot. He fixed a place behind the stove, put down a box, and the dog got in it. I saw him the rest of the night. Every time I turned around, Hawkins was in there with that dog maybe every 20 minutes or so, checking to be sure that the dog was all right, that the dog was okay. About 5:30, we were going to be changing shifts, getting ready, because the other shift would come at 6 or 6:30. And he came out into the ward, and I was at the bedside of another patient, and he came over and he says, Miss, I need to talk to you. I need to talk to you." And I said, "All right," and I stepped away, and we stood out in the hallway between the 2 rows of cots. "Miss, we've got something we've got to do right now." And I said, well, what are you talking about? What do we have to do right now? We have to name our dog. Our dog? Is that what you're calling that dog, our dog? Well, yes, ma'am. We brought it in. We saved it. It's our dog, and he needs a name. I started to argue with him, and then I thought, is that worth an argument? I don't think so. Well, have you thought of a name, Hawkins? Yes, I have, ma'am. Yes, I have. That's a prince of a dog. And I would like, and I think it would be right, if we called him Prince. Oh, my. Well, if that's the name that you like, you go ahead and call him that. Well, he did. He started calling him Prince. And when the other staff came in at 6 o'clock, he opened the door of the little office and called for the Prince to come out into the ward. Now, if you know dogs, and this was a wooden floor in that ward, you can just imagine it, the sound of that dog's toenails scraping on the wood as it came out of that little office and ran down the length and then turned around and ran back. And when those men in the bed heard him, those that could raised their heads. They looked. Some held out their arms. Some sat up and whistled for the dog to come to them. It was really something wonderful to see. And the dog took his time, and he gave everybody a turn. You know, I have brothers. I've seen that before. Dogs and boys and men, they really go together. A man loves a dog. We turned Prince over that morning to the next staff, and they kept him. Absolutely, they kept him. In fact, Prince stayed in that ward until we went home, back to the USA a year later. I've thought of him often, Hawkins, of course, and the big black dog that he decided to call Prince. I hope you'll come back, perhaps hear another story from France during World War I. Thank you.